Third letter from Marie Louise. This August 15th, 1814, the Emperor's birthday. I have had no answer yet from my father to the letter which I spoke to you about in my last. This uncertainty seems to me very cruel and very long. I am awaiting for the answer with a great deal of impatience, and I will let you know about it at once. I have a black presentiment that it will be nothing pleasant to hear, but I am in one of my sad moods today, so I may be mistaken. How can I be happy on the 15th when I am obliged to pass this feast day so solemn to me, far from the two persons who are dearest to me? I beg your pardon for thus speaking to you of my sad thoughts, but the friendship and the interest which you have always shown me embolden me. Provided you will let me know when I bore you, I beg you to believe in my sincere friendship. Your affectionate Louise. P.S. I have just received a letter from Parma, which informs me that Monsieur de Mariscalchi has been replaced by Monsieur de Meneval, who has just upset the entire provisional government. Monsieur de Mariscalchi is now nothing but Austrian ambassador at my court. My father has also appointed Monsieur de Saint-Vital as my Grand Chamberlain, and that without consulting me. This grieves and vexes me. Monsieur Meneval said in Parma that my father had sent Monsieur de Saint-Vital to go to Vienna to fulfill his functions in my service, and that I should be invited to go to Vienna during the whole period of the Congress. What a sad prospect! I have half a mind to ask him to allow me to spend the winter in Florence, promising him to write to the Emperor only through the Grand Duke. It seems almost certain that he will refuse. But about one thing, my mind is made up. I will not go to Vienna whilst the sovereigns are there. Advise me, I beg of you. I assure you, I am much to be pitied. Fourth letter. This 15th August in the evening. I have just received your letter of August 9th. I am really much distressed at the time that letters take to come. One gets such old news. I send you a copy of a letter from Prince Metternich, which will acquaint you with the news which Monsieur de Kertzai brought me. I am very unhappy indeed at the idea of being forced to return to Vienna, all the more so that no good reason for it is given to me. I do not think I shall go to Vienna before the end of September or the beginning of October. I shall leave here on September 3rd or 4th and shall go to Geneva and thence to Bern, where I shall spend a fortnight, besides a week in Geneva, and after that I shall go on to Vienna. I am very vexed about this on Madame de Meneval's account. If you can bring her to Geneva, she can follow you after her confinement. If you come and share my exile, I know how tedious it will be for you. At the same time, I am too selfish not to desire it. I want your advice. I need your conversation. You know all the confidence which I have in you. One of the pleasantest thoughts which I can have just now is the thought of keeping you by me. I also send you a letter which came here for Monsieur Emmeline. Be good enough to send it to him. As regards to the paymaster, I can promise nothing, less now than ever. For you see, I am consulted about nothing. I do not think it at all right. They ought to, at least, to treat an unfortunate with a little delicacy of feeling. The Duchess will tell you a lot of things by word of mouth, which I cannot write, for I am very sad, though resigned. The hardest blow will be struck tomorrow when I have to say goodbye to the Duchess. But I do not complain. I ought to be accustomed to every possible misfortune. But what comforts me is the thought that there are some good people who have pity for me. And I have pleasure in thinking that you are one of these, begging you to believe in all my esteem and confidence, your affectionate Louise. Fifth letter. This 20th of August in the evening. I received your letter of the 12th of this month yesterday, and I see with pleasure that you have received some of my letters, but surely you must have received one in which I spoke of the wretched answer which my father gave me. I am very much touched by your offer to follow me under any circumstances whatsoever, and I stand in great need of good advice. It is more necessary to me now than ever, and I so hope I shall soon have the pleasure of seeing you again. I wish you to arrange it so that you will be deprived of Madame de Meneval's society as short a time as possible. I quite see how sad that would be, and I'm afraid she will get to have a grudge against me. I have answered my father as well as Prince Metternich and used fine phrases in writing to the latter about all the confidence I had in him. And I especially insisted on the satisfaction I felt in the promise which was given me that I could go to Parma. It appears that Monsieur Macaulay has made some very good changes and reformed many of the abuses of the provisional government. I have received long letters from Monsieur de Bausset, which I will communicate to you when I return. I want to bother you with all of my affairs. I have received news of the Emperor on August 6th. He speaks very well of you and begs me not to believe all that may be said against him. He was in good health, happy and quiet, and was thinking greatly about my son and myself. Write to me, I pray you, with great punctuality, and believe in all my friendship from your very affectionate Marie-Louise. I do not want to reproduce too large a number of the letters which I had the honor to receive from the Empress Marie-Louise. The literal extracts which I have just given suffice for the purpose which I had before me in quoting them. 1 month after the Empress's arrival in Aix, the Duchess de Montebello, Messieurs Corvisart and Isabelle left this city one after the other. The first two to return to Paris. Monsieur Isabelle went off to Vienna, where he was to paint the portraits of the sovereigns assembled in the Congress. After their departure, the Empress remained another fortnight at Aix, anxiously awaiting the effect of the promises which had been renewed to her when she left Vienna. The letter from Prince Metternich, which was alluded to in one of the letters from Marie-Louise, which I have reproduced, destroyed some of the Empress's illusions. This letter informed her that the possession of the sovereignty which had devolved upon her by the treaty was no longer certain, and invited her into the Emperor's name to return to Vienna and to put her interests in his hands. A letter from the Emperor of Austria contained the same invitation. The Empress abandoned two sad presentiments, losing a hope which she had entertained till then of being free to enjoy the independence of which she had dreamt, gave way to a new influence which shook the constancy of her attachment to the Emperor and persuaded her that she stood in need of other protection. She grew to think that by submission she might be able to remove the obstacles which stood in the way of her possession of Parma, and she resigned herself to obey orders which it was no longer in her power to avoid. General Neipperg, placed exclusively in her confidence and who was to be united to her by much closer bonds later on, was commissioned to conduct her to Vienna. Before continuing this narrative, I desire to tarry over the first period of the life, still innocent as I judged it, of a princess born with qualities which would have commended her to the respect of France, if nature, in endowing her with these qualities, had added a greater firmness of character. Extraordinary circumstances had united her destiny to that of a great man. These bonds had been violently severed by the selfish and cold policy which had formed them on the day when Napoleon was no longer to be feared. The fault into which Marie-Louise fell must above all be imputed to those in whose hands she was the instrument of hatred and revenge. Our compatriots, under the influence of recent impressions or of recollections, the bitterness of which no revelations have come to temper, have blamed Marie-Louise with almost unanimous reprobation. This anathema, I can assert, would grieve the Emperor Napoleon were he still living. The woman whom he honored with his alliance, to whom he owed some happy days, the mother of his much beloved son, the woman of whom he never ceased to speak with generous kindness, who was passive but not aggressive towards him, whose difficult situation he appreciated, whose long struggles he took into consideration, has a right to some indulgence on our part also. Let us reserve our indignation for those who have caused and hurried on her downfall. I left Paris on September 6th, but in spite of the haste with which I traveled, I could not reach Geneva before the morning of the 9th. I proceeded without waste of time to Secheron's, where the Empress was living since she had left Aix, and I was received by her in an extremely friendly manner. She was just about to leave for Bern, and then to undertake an excursion in the Oberland. Her plan was to visit several parts of Switzerland and to prolong her stay so as to arrive as late as possible in Vienna. She was good enough to ask me to accompany her on her excursions and appointed a meeting at Bern. I had occasion to congratulate her on the happy state of mind in which she seemed to be. Countess de Brignol, several persons of her household, and General Neipperg, who had attached himself to her footsteps in order to carry out the mission which he had received, were with her at Secheron's. I saw her a short time at Secheron, and she put off until her arrival in Bern the opportunity of speaking to me about a number of things which she wished to discuss minutely with me. On leaving her, I heard that an officer who is a general today, the husband of one of her dames d'annonce, who had arrived some days previously from the island of Elba, had brought her a letter from the Emperor. This officer was commissioned to conduct her to the island of Elba, where she was expected, but he left for Paris on the day before my return without ever having been able to fulfill his mission. After having rested a day at Secheron, I went to spend a day at Prengain, an estate situated a distance of 4 leagues from Geneva on the shores of the lake, where the excellent Queen Julia, wife of Joseph Bonaparte, had recently arrived with her children. I was very anxious to see this noble and virtuous family once more. They had received me in my youth with very much kindness, and with them I had spent many happy days at Mortefontaine. I had not seen the prince or the princess since I had taken leave of them at Orleans. I found King Joseph just as he had always been, amiable and unpretentious, returned like Cincinnatus to his plow, much more taken up with the details of his rustic life and his brother's future fate than with the remembrance of the brilliant and stormy career which he himself had just brought to a close. Joseph Bonaparte loved Napoleon as much as he had admired him. There existed between the two brothers a sympathy which the difference in their characters, apart from the bond of fraternity, no doubt contributed to strengthen. Napoleon, a mighty mind, carried on to splendid actions by the sublimity of his genius, can be compared to nobody. The glory of brilliant enterprises which would not have been above his faculties did not tempt Joseph Bonaparte's ambition, but he knew how to display in business, when once he was engaged in it, the activity and energy which it demanded. To the negotiations which occupied the first period of his political career, he had brought the lights of a keen and profound mind, clear and easy eloquence of discussion, and a straightforwardness which was proof against anything. He displayed the same talents and the same qualities in his administration of the 2 countries which he was called upon to govern: a gentle philosophy, the qualities of a gentleman, a straightforward heart, a noble character would have drawn attention to him in any condition of life, and, as the emperor used to say, would have made him the ornament of society. The difference in the characters of the 2 brothers is characterized by a remark which was sometimes addressed to me by Napoleon as first consul, before Joseph Bonaparte had consented to take an active part in his system. Why is Joseph, with all of his talents, so lazy? Napoleon applied the term laziness to moderation, which kept his brother away from the pompous cares and brilliant chains of rank, which is the object of the envy of almost all mankind. King Joseph's wife was a type of goodness. In the most fragile frame, she had a strong mind and lofty reason. Her life was one continued exercise of kindnesses. The time she spent on the 2 thrones, of which she said with very rare philosophy that the woman who comes down from a throne is perhaps happier than she who ascends one, was particularly distinguished by the fact that the sphere of her benevolence extended itself more widely. This digression has taken me away from my subject. I allowed myself to be carried away by the pleasure of speaking of my host at Prengan and of seeing friends whom one is glad to find again after the tempest is over. The time which I spent at their house passed rapidly, and I only arrived at Bern after the Empress. She had left word for me to follow her together with her itinerary of her journey up to the 21st. As at the same time, she had been good enough to give me the choice of remaining in Bern. I preferred to do the latter. The Empress was followed in this journey by Count Nyberg and by one of this general's officers. Comtesse de Brignoles and one of the dames de Nance were the only French people who accompanied her on this journey. On my way from Prengan to Bern, I stopped at Payerne. Just as I was leaving, I was told that a traveler who had passed the night in the hotel wished to speak to me. I followed the host, who conducted me to a room where I was as surprised as I was pleased to find King Louis, who was traveling in Switzerland under the name of the Count of St. Louis. I had not seen him since the marriage festivities, not even at Blois, where I had not been acquainted with his presence until the moment when he had left town. He was in bed and was suffering greatly from the disease, which had only grown worse as years went on. I spent an hour by his bedside. He spoke to me of recent events with bitter regret and of his brother with sentiments of true affection. He was still under the sad impression of the Emperor's attempt on his life at Fontainebleau and judged the immensity of his unhappiness by the desperate action. He said that heaven, which had prevented so great a disaster, doubtless reserved him for fresh glories, but also for fresh trials. If Louis XVIII had killed himself, he added, he would not be today in the place of the Tuileries. Count St. Louis was that day a prophet without knowing it. He charged me with a letter for the Empress, and I left him very pleased with the unexpected hazard of this meeting. Whilst awaiting the Empress's return, I made some excursions, having nothing else to do, in the pretty country round Bern. On the 21st, which was the day in which Marie-Louise was to return from the glaciers, in my impatience to see her again, I went to meet her at Thun. I found her well pleased with her journey, which, according to those who accompanied her, had been a fatiguing one, but she had not suffered much thereby. She was kind enough to come and see me at Madame de Brignoles' house, where I had alighted. I followed her into her apartment, and she said the kindest things to me about my return and the mark of affection which I had given her in leaving my family to follow her. She spoke to me at length of the difficulties which were put in the way of her establishment in Parma, and of the bitter regret which she felt at being obliged to return to Vienna, where her position during the Congress was most equivocal. I spoke to her of the Emperor. She said she had received no news of him since the arrival of Colonel Herau, and that she had been unable to comply with Napoleon's request that she should join him on the island of Elba without having consulted her father, whose intentions must have been known to him since reading the letter from Prince Metternich, which she had sent him. It was Count Nyberg, as one may well think, who had pointed out this objection to her. Marie-Louise had heard during her journey of the death of the Queen of Sicily, her grandmother, who succumbed to a night attack of apoplexy. This princess had tried in vain to reach the pull bell, and when she was found in the morning, it was seen that her hand was stretched out to grasp it, but had not been able to reach it. So as to not sadden the pleasures of the Congress with a spectacle of mourning, it was decided in a lofty place that the official notification of the death of the Emperor Francis's mother-in-law should not be made till its close. Thanks to this fiction, which left the dead queen still living, the festivities were not interrupted.